Going to close my door.
All right, so we'll get started then. Good morning, everybody. Good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to our sixth webinar. This is our first webinar in 2024. My name is Sin Chong. I'm the convener of the Research Synthesis and Applied Linguistics Special Interest Group. This is one of the special interest groups of BAL, the British Association for Applied Linguistics. And in today's webinar, I'm very, very happy to have my dear colleague, Dr. Melissa Bond, here with us to talk about synthesizing qualitative evidence. It's a topic that I think a lot of us is interested in, and probably some of us has done it, but probably not doing it very well. So I think today Mel is going to walk us through some of the tips and share some of her projects, I guess, on this topic. Just a brief introduction of Mel for those who may not know her. So Melissa Bond, it's a research fellow at the EPI Center at UCL and the National Institute of Teaching in England. She's also an adjunct associate professor in qualitative evidence synthesis at the University of Stavanger. Her research focuses in particular on how evidence synthesis can build research skills, provide insight into digital teaching and learning, to provide guidance to both policy and practice, and identify key research gaps. So as you can see from Mel's profile, her other area of expertise is educational technology. Melissa is a member of the Center for Open Education Research, a founding editorial board member of the Nordic Journal of Systematic Reviews in Education, and a fellow co-editor-in-chief of the Journal Review of Education. Mel, I'll hand it over to you. I'm sure we'll enjoy it very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak to you today. And apologies for the fact it's taken a little bit longer than we expected to be able to organise. But I'm really, really glad we've been able to bring it all together. So I'll just share my slide. Right, excellent. I mean, after that wonderful introduction from Sin Wang, I'm not sure what else I can really sort of say to augment that. But yes, we are here today to talk about using qualitative methods to synthesize evidence, and not just purely from a qualitative evidence synthesis perspective, but also from like a creative evidence synthesis perspective as well. Yes, Sin Wang has just stolen my thunder. As you mentioned, he's already mentioned this. These are my affiliations. I do have a lot of fingers in a lot of different pies. I absolutely love anything to do with evidence synthesis. And lately I've been doing a lot more in terms of exploring the uses of digital evidence synthesis tools, especially those that use machine learning, automation to be able to speed up the process. And that's my main role at the Epicenter at the moment, is working on understanding how digital evidence synthesis tools being used in the field of climate and health, actually, which is outside my education purview. But it's also been really interesting to then compare the use and quality of reporting of evidence synthesis in the field of education and educational technology specifically, with how that is currently happening in the field of climate and health, and what can tell us about the types of evidence synthesis tools that we are creating, that we're using, what changes need to be made in order to help us use them more effectively, and also what it tells us about what researchers need to know in order to conduct really robust, rigorous evidence synthesis. In terms of the different types of evidence synthesis that I've undertaken, Sin Wang's already sort of alluded to this, being predominantly in educational technology. And as I mentioned, also now looking at climate and health. But I have a fairly, like I've mentioned, a fairly creative way of looking at different ways that we can answer some of these bigger questions that we need answers to. And I don't particularly I guess, ascribe myself to any one particular approach, even though I am sort of more a qualitative researcher, and that is the same when it comes to evidence synthesis. I like to look at it as a yeah, what kind of method can best answer my research questions? What kind of type of evidence synthesis product will help me answer those questions and then help me to better provide implications and advice and guidance to both practitioners, also researchers, also policymakers. You know, what kind of changes can we be suggesting to be able to help improve situations? I say this in every talk that I give because this is how I see the world and this is how I see evidence synthesis. I see it as looking at the galaxy of evidence that exists rather than focusing on one single star or one single study in isolation, so that we are seeing the broader perspective of the state of evidence. So why are systematic reviews so important? Well, apart from gaining that understanding of the galaxy of evidence, we are using them to then identify any gaps, consistencies, or inconsistencies that that come through in the evidence that we're looking at. And then, of course, it can then help inform policy and practice going forwards. But different types of systematic reviews and different types of evidence synthesis have been developed so that they are a transparent and explicit method to being able to conduct this type of work. They should be replicable and they should be updatable. And this is so that we're reducing some of that inherent bias that can creep in when we're conducting evidence synthesis. There are so many different types of evidence syntheses within the review family. And this was, I really like this work that was done by Anthea Sutton and her colleagues, looking at trying to understand just how many different forms that we already have in this review family. So they mapped it out across these 7 different review families. And qualitative evidence synthesis traditionally, according to these people, would fit within this qualitative review family. So qualitative evidence synthesis, qualitative metasynthesis, and meta-ethnography. But I'm going to talk to you today about looking at qualitative evidence synthesis more broadly and how it can be used as an approach within, for example, scoping and mapping reviews, content analysis, but also systematic reviews, umbrella reviews, and so on. And I would also add that bibliometric reviews are obviously more associated with quantitative kind of approaches, but they're not sort of captured here in this particular review family. And I would also say that there are particular aspects of bibliometric reviews that can lend themselves or have qualitative approaches lend themselves to the conduct of bibliometric reviews as well. And by that, I mean, in terms of looking at code word analysis and some of these citation analyses and different ways of clustering information that can also be used to used alongside qualitative approaches that can be, I guess, used to augment them. So we're going to talk today about what qualitative evidence synthesis is. I'm going to briefly talk about 3 different types of approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis, being meta-ethnography, thematic synthesis, and framework synthesis. And I'll give some of my own examples mixed in with some other examples from wider educational research. Pardon me. And I'm going to talk also about different digital evidence synthesis tools that can help you undertake your evidence synthesis work. And then finally, we'll end with a little bit of time for questions and answers. But as Sinwang knows, because we've worked together quite a bit, I do have a tendency to talk quickly, so I apologize. I'll try and talk as slowly as I can. When I talk about things I'm very passionate about, I get quite quick with my speech. So if I am getting a bit quick, please perhaps pop it in the chat or otherwise alert me. But hopefully we'll also have the transcript, and I will make the slides available at the end. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to write them in the chat as we go, and I can either address them as we go, or I'll preferably sort of talk to you at the end. So, qualitative evidence synthesis is an umbrella term, and it is an umbrella term for the group of methods used to undertake systematic reviews of qualitative research evidence. So traditionally, and for example, in the case of meta-ethnography, this would be where purely qualitative studies, primary studies, are being synthesized using a qualitative approach. However, as I've already alluded to, my take on qualitative evidence synthesis is slightly different. So in terms of what I mean by qualitative studies, primary studies, of course, we're talking about research studies that use a qualitative method of data collection and analysis. And so therefore, the systematic review of those kinds of studies allows us to synthesize these findings so that it is moving the understanding of the evidence beyond that single study, is looking for patterns in the qualitative studies across the corpus of evidence. And we're really using it to explore those similarities and differences across different contexts or between different settings as well. They allow us to explore, describe, and understand current knowledge, but they also allow us to generate new theories, to develop conceptual models, and, as I've already said, to identify gaps in research. And if you notice, we've used some images generated by DALL-E, the ChatGPT image generation bot. So some of that, I don't know if you've noticed, but some of their words don't come up beautifully spelled. Anyway, ignore that. The graphics are pretty. And of course, qualitative research, it does need its own methods for synthesis, which reflects the qualitative paradigm, rather than simply using the same approaches to systematic reviews that have really come from the health and welfare sort of discipline, where, medicine in particular, we need to look at different RCT results, different experimental results for drugs, for example, to see what's the most effective across the broad range of those studies. Here, though, especially when it comes to education, we need to be able to consider just the broad variety of research that's being undertaken in a wide variety of schools or institutions in higher education, and to be able to synthesize that evidence in the best way possible, which, using some of those very quantitative ways of thinking about the world, just simply aren't appropriate. So I'm going to talk about meta-ethnography first, and then we'll look at thematic and framework synthesis. So meta-ethnography is an approach that does use purely qualitative research. It leads to the creation of some descriptive second-order constructs and some higher order or what's called third-order constructs. The aim of it is to produce novel interpretations and understandings rather than aggregating findings. So rather than adding up counts of how often certain codes appear within different studies or how often a phenomenon appears, we're looking at really understanding the interpretations behind the data, behind quotes from participants across all of the qualitative studies, to develop new understandings and new findings. So it involves comparing the conceptual data from those primary qualitative studies to identify and develop new concepts, theories, and models. So instead of, for example, looking at just the findings of the authors of the review and what they think the data means, you would also be taking all of that original data used by the primary authors and coming up with your own interpretations of what it means across the corpus. So this is really helpful in terms of informing guideline development, and it's a really great way of being able to handle a lot of that thick, rich, qualitative data, those quotes from your participants. However, it is quite a complex methodology, and it's not one that would be advisable to tackle perhaps in your first or even second evidence synthesis project. It does, though, allow you to include findings that have a mix of empirical evidence, but also expert opinion and conjecture. But because of that, it requires a lot of caution in terms of how you would go about approaching this. So I thought I would show you an example meta-ethnography and the different features of this particular approach. So this study is about children's experiences of the journey between home and school. And it uses meta-ethnography to synthesize ethnographic and qualitative research on their experiences of that school journey. And its aim was to build an interpretation of the experiences and to show how and to what extent that phenomenon is understood. So they followed, and this is a particular approach that's widely cited, is Noblet and Hare, and they used the CASP tool for quality appraisal. Now, the CASP tools, if you haven't come across it before, it is the critical appraisal tool that has been developed, and they've developed it for not just qualitative studies, but also quantitative, systematic reviews, mixed methods, and all sorts of things. And they actually used the spider approach to be able to come up with their search strategy. So here you can see that they were focused on children, which makes sense, and their school environments. But for this particular evidence synthesis design, they chose to include different types of qualitative approaches to data collection. So they included specific phrases around, for example, semi-structured interviews, around focus groups, photo elicitation, case studies, and those sorts of very qualitative approaches to collecting and analysing data, which, to be honest, in my approaches to qualitative evidence synthesis, I wouldn't necessarily choose to do. But because this is a meta-ethnography, it is one way of very quickly identifying studies that do use those qualitative approaches. However, a word of warning in this case is that when you are searching in databases, in electronic databases, and you are searching the titles, abstracts, and maybe keywords as well, it is very rare, very, very rare that that your studies will be so specific about the method used, even when it comes to qualitative research methods, that they would be this specific in their abstracts, and certainly not this specific necessarily in their title. So by using those phrases in their search string, they're going to limit the studies that are returned in their search. So my advice would be, even with a meta-ethnography, not to include those particular phrases, but instead to consider qualitative mixed methods, those sort of more broader umbrella terms for methodological approaches, rather than narrowing it down to these types of data collection methods. They've also used experiences. So again, trying to capture sort of your qualitative I guess, phraseology in terms of, what they might capture. Again, this will seriously limit the types of studies that you're able to find. And instead, where they've got research type, as I mentioned, this is a lot more along the lines of what I would suggest you include if you're going to be searching for purely qualitative research. They had quite well-defined inclusion and exclusion criteria, as you would have with any form of qualitative, any form of evidence synthesis. And what they've also done, which I highly recommend you do in any evidence synthesis project, is include either within the text or perhaps preferably as an appendix, include each of these studies with their study design information. So making sure that you're including things like number of participants, who the participants were, where they were located, what was the context, because that can seriously influence not only the findings of any individual study, but how generalizable those findings can be to other contexts. So they've provided some really detailed information here about the methodology and the data collection and analysis. What they've also then done is included a tabulation of the analysis that they did with those second and third order constructs that they found across the studies. And so here, any person who is reading this particular piece of work would be able to very quickly see, okay, so in terms of feeling vulnerable, any study with an X shows examples of where students felt vulnerable in their journey home from school. And in particular, Kuhlman, for example, and Kuhlman and Paludan found that students were feeling fearful and frustrated with traffic. A really fantastic overview of the themes and concepts that they found within these studies. What you can also clearly see here with this particular table is that through their quality appraisal of those studies, they've been able to separate these findings by what they've called key papers, which I imagine would be those studies that were judged to be of a higher quality, as opposed to those that are considered satisfactory. And then further below, which you can't see on the screenshot, would be perhaps those that they consider lower quality. So very easily, people are able to see where the higher quality evidence is and perhaps where you might give more weight to the evidence that they found. So that was a very quick whistle-stop tour of meta-ethnography. So the key things to remember there are, if you're wanting to synthesize purely qualitative evidence, you can use a meta-ethnographical approach. You shouldn't just limit your search string to including those qualitative data collection methods, because it will hinder the recall and sensitivity of your search string, your search strategy. And to make sure that you still conduct a quality assessment and that you provide those really clear tabulations of the study characteristics, the study design, but also of the thematic findings, the concepts that you found in terms of the actual findings of your synthesis. Now, thematic synthesis is probably an approach that you would be most familiar with when it comes to qualitative synthesis work, because it's also an approach that is used for primary qualitative studies as well. It is considered probably the most accessible form of qualitative synthesis, because it's looking at developing descriptive themes across studies. And so because of that, it is considered the most suitable form for what these authors have termed novice reviewers, or perhaps for your first or second evidence synthesis project. And it involves the systematic coding of data across the studies that you have found in order to generate these descriptive and analytical themes. And this can be done using either a deductive approach or an inductive approach. So deductive meaning that you have already got some themes identified from literature that you've looked at previously. And then you are looking in the text for those themes, and you are coding the text to those themes that you'd already pre-identified. An inductive approach, on the other hand, is when you are identifying the themes as they emerge throughout the text. So you haven't come to the body of evidence with any preconceived ideas of what you're likely to find. And that's when it is purely an inductive approach. It's emerging from the evidence. You can, of course, which I often do, use those two in conjunction together, both starting out with some deductive, perhaps higher order themes. So, for example, if you were thinking about that meta-ethnography we've just looked at, perhaps you would already have in mind that you expect to find examples of students feeling vulnerable, or that they might be negotiating, managing risks. So you might already come to your review with these ideas, but you don't have any idea of exactly how that's going to appear in the evidence itself. So then you would add these third order constructs as you go, as you're reading, as you're coding. So the pros for thematic synthesis: it is a really good approach for when you don't necessarily have a lot of thick data. So you don't necessarily have a lot of participant quotes in the studies that you are synthesizing. But you can also then use it for what's called thin data and thick data, and you're able to navigate them into more sort of in-depth themes. However, this might result in being overly simplistic in terms of the themes that develop, because then you might find that you've got a whole range of different themes that you've identified in the text, but that you're then not able to really synthesize between and across the studies in your evidence synthesis. So a thematic example I found in the applied linguistics field was this particular publication by Liu and colleagues from 2016, which was published in the Educational Research Review. And that was looking at best practices in L2 English source use pedagogy. And one of the reasons I picked this particular example was because of the way that they were providing evidence of how they went about their coding when it came to their synthesis. So here you can see that they used categories in terms of source use norms, source use acquisition. Then they looked at existing problems related to L2 novice writer source use. So, for example, cultural relevance, intertextuality, citation practice. And they've provided examples from the studies that they've used in their synthesis as well here. And then they've also matched these to proposed pedagogical solutions for each of these different elements, which is one way to be able to approach your thematic synthesis. Another way that I've used in my own work is to start out using a computer-assisted content analysis approach. So one of the digital evidence synthesis tools that I've used is Leximancer. Now, it isn't free, unfortunately, but there are some other similar tools that are free that I'll mention a little bit later. And what this does is it looks at the relations between the concepts in the text that you upload, and it looks at the frequency and connectedness between those texts in 3-sentence blocks. And what it does is it produces these overarching concepts, these thematic bubbles, and it produces the themes that are the most prevalent in the text that you have. So, for example, here in this case, students, pandemic, social, data, classes, e-learning. I mean, no two guesses about what study this particular evidence synthesis was looking at. It was looking at, obviously, teaching and learning during the pandemic. And then it provides some key concepts within those bubbles and shows you how those concepts are connected together. So in a way, it is a starting point for developing the key themes, or gaining an understanding of what key themes are emerging from the evidence that you're synthesizing. And so I've used that for a number of different studies, both within, for example, this authorship and content analysis of the British Journal of Educational Technology, but I've also used it within other synthesis projects, such as a rapid review and mapping reviews as well. So for me, I don't see thematic synthesis as just a standalone product, a standalone type of evidence synthesis, which Sutton and colleagues in their review family did. I see it as an analytical approach that can also be used within mapping and systematic reviews and scoping reviews and different types of reviews that you can do. So here, in this particular example, I used it to be able to identify trends that had occurred in educational technology research across 50 years within the British Journal of Educational Technology. So I started out with looking at what the software produced, which is what you can see here across the 50 years. And, you know, it was able to identify that learning and students were the key concern through these particular pathways. And it looked at how students were engaging in the learning environment, in their experiences of teaching and learning, and how effective teaching was able to help support those processes. And from that point, I was able then to go deeper into the studies that have been published using these overarching themes that had been identified to be able to provide examples of how those themes emerged throughout the research. And that enabled me to identify some topics that have been experienced within the literature across those 50 years. So, for example, inappropriate technology equipment, the lack of professional development that's been available, device compatibility, and so on and so forth. And so aside from that overarching 50 years analysis that I did, I also did one per 10 years. So I also did 5-year, produced 5-year concept maps. And I was able then to also see and identify which of these particular issues have become endemic. So they really, they're issues that have been persistent across at least a couple of decades or even more in some cases. For example, the ongoing suspicion and caution about educational technology. So it is a form of thematic synthesis where we're able to identify themes that have occurred in the studies, but it's using a slightly different approach, using that computer-assisted approach. I'll just check the chat and take this opportunity to have a quick sip of my coffee whilst I read it. Yes, right. So the question from David, thank you very much. Did I say that one of the inclusion criteria was that the study was ethnographic? I'm guessing this was from the meta-ethnography approach. How is this established? Couldn't evidence synthesis be mixed methods also? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's what I'm trying to say today in my talk to you, is that even though the way that I approach my evidence synthesis projects comes from a qualitative paradigm, it comes from an idea of trying to understand the world and how it's experienced and how the studies showcase those experiences. I used in my evidence synthesis a mixture of quantitative and qualitative approaches. And even though it is, for me, it is mixed methods, that I do use mixed methods, I still come at it from a qualitative paradigm. However, there are also some mixed methods. And if I quickly flick back, bear with, I do apologize. I'm going to flick back to that. I'll get out of that. Flick back to that review family. Where is it? Here it is. The review family slide, which also shows that there, according to Sutton and colleagues, that there is that mixed methods review family as well. So according to these researchers, they've classified qualitative and mixed methods as completely separate. Is there any recommended quality evaluation tools for meta-ethnography? Yeah, so there's the one that I mentioned, which is the CASP tool. And I'll quickly, at the end, perhaps I'll grab that link for you, the critical appraisal synthesis tools for you. That's one in particular that I would highly recommend because it is so pertinent to qualitative. It's purely about qualitative research. Other tools, yeah, I would say that was probably the best one from my experience. Other tools are more, so the mixed methods appraisal tool is one that I've also used in quite a few of my reviews. And I use that because it has separate sections for quantitative, qualitative, and different types of quantitative studies, qualitative mixed methods. It has specific questions pertaining to the type of method that was used. So that's also one that I would recommend, and I'll share those links with you. Perhaps when I share the slides, I'll add some extra resources for you at the end. So David, I'm sorry, I didn't really answer your question very well. The answer is yes, you can have mixed methods evidence synthesis, absolutely. But for me personally, even though I use mixed approaches, my kind of paradigm is overall qualitative. Perhaps we can have a bit more of a chat about that at another time. So let me pick up from where I've left off. And if you're interested in knowing a little bit more about qualitative evidence synthesis, there are training opportunities I'm sure I could share with you. There's some great professional development. We're currently developing with the team at Stavanger. We're actually currently developing a qualitative evidence synthesis online course. I'm not sure if it's going to be free, but I'm hoping it will be. And so that'll be available as well. So yes, framework synthesis. Now, again, right from the off, I'm going to admit to you that even though framework synthesis can be its own special method and a review can be called a framework synthesis, I have used framework synthesis within the scope of a systematic review as the analytical method. And that's one of the examples I'm going to be sharing with you today. So framework synthesis is used to explore or test theories, and it can be derived from a pre-existing review, from a conceptual model, from a policy framework, or from a logic model. The pros of a framework synthesis is that it can handle both qualitative and quantitative evidence, which I enjoy, because there is definitely a place for just purely one or the other. But I find that the best way to understand the state of an intervention or the state of any particular, I guess, topic that you're looking at is to take in the evidence from all sides. Framework synthesis also represents theory really well, and it's a great way of being able to structure your evidence synthesis work and to then also structure your discussion section. And it can also offer some time saving, especially if you're already starting with a predefined framework. However, you do need to make sure that the framework you choose is explicitly justified and that it's appropriate to the work that you're doing and to the research questions that you have and that you're trying to answer. Sometimes you might start off with one particular framework and then get to your synthesis work, your coding, your data extraction, your synthesis, and actually find, oh, this framework isn't very useful for how I'm wanting to answer my research questions. It doesn't match the data that I have. And so at that point, you either need to change the framework that you're using, or you need to adapt the framework as a result. And then that can be the result of the work that you're doing. And of course, with that, you have the risk of then, if you're so desperate to use one particular framework, you might then find yourself trying to make the data fit this predefined framework, and it just doesn't. So that is also an issue. So it's a really good, and I like this this image from Ginny Brunton and colleagues about considering the different dimensions in terms of the approaches to the synthesis that you're looking to do. So are you wanting to construct a framework that out of the data that you're synthesizing? Are you wanting to be able to have that framework developed throughout the process? Or are you wanting to use the framework use a predefined framework from the beginning, apply the data to that, and then that's the end product? Or are you wanting to start off with a framework, find out how that framework can be adapted, augmented, and improved, and then have that as your product? And that's something that really needs to be thought about. So the example that I wanted to share with you, again, this was a systematic review. It's not called a framework synthesis, but I have used a synthesis approach when it came to my analysis. So this was all about understanding how the flipped learning approach can affect student engagement in schools. I did use EpiReviewer, which is a evidence synthesis tool that I'm going to share with you shortly. And I was looking at, as I said, flipped learning across I guess it was meant to be a 5-year period, but I suppose it's a 6-year period. And it included 107 studies. I started out with a predefined framework. I used a conceptual framework that I developed already through previous theoretical work in my PhD. And I then used these indicators from my framework to be able to code the studies. So in my data extraction coding tool, which you can see, this is what it looks like in EpiReviewer. I use those dimensions of engagement and disengagement and the indicators of those different dimensions to be able to code the results of the studies I was synthesizing. I then also, and that's how it looks in EpiReviewer. So making sure that you're coding evidence to each and every, and that is something I implore you to do, please. Make sure that you have evidence from each study for any code that you're applying. You spell it with a double P. There we go. And so I'd started out with these framework. I started out with these dimensions and these indicators, but as I was coding the studies, I was coming up with other indicators of engagement that hadn't come up previously. So I was able to add those to that particular understanding of engagement. I was also able to add extra understanding of how different external factors influence and affect student engagement. You can see that here, where there's so like the immediate sort of teaching and learning environment that impacts on student engagement to the wider exo and macro system. And I was able to show in my discussion section how the data that I had synthesized then affected our understanding of the impacts on student engagement through that framework. And again, specifically in terms of the learning environment and technology, the importance of content length when it comes to the length of videos that we are producing for our students, as well as the importance of aligning curriculum to learning outcomes and reinforcing ideas and concepts. And like I said, I called it at the beginning. I'm talking too much. There's not going to be much time for question and answer. So I'm going to have to try and speed up slightly. And I do apologize. But you can always get in touch with me and we can have a chat if you've got specific questions as well. But there's a lot of different software, lots of different digital evidence synthesis tools that you can use to help you undertake this type of work. And I'm going to talk very briefly about these ones. So Rayan is a free tool, and I apologize, these screenshots are from quite a long time ago. It may look different now. It is free. That is a good thing. Personally, I don't love it, but I am biased. So we'll put that out there. It's fantastic for postgraduate students who perhaps don't have research funding of their own to be able to have an accessible tool that they can use. Allows you to label your data, very similar in a way to the way In Vivo works if you've used that or any other qualitative synthesis software. I've mentioned Leximancer. Again, it's not free. There is a free version, a free trial you can use though. So that's really good. And they have free webinars. And there's also, of course, In Vivo, but that is expensive. So hopefully your institution has access to that. I don't use that. Personally, I always use EpiReviewer to be able to code my themes and my concepts. FOSS Viewer is also an example of a tool that you could use, a computer-assisted tool to help you to develop those themes or make those connections. And that is free. And there's some really good guidance there about how you could use that. It is more associated, like I said, with bibliometric studies, with quantitative studies, but there is no reason why you couldn't use that to help you start defining or identifying themes in literature. And this is EpiReviewer. So EpiReviewer, it isn't free. It does have a very small cost involved because we're a not-for-profit, but there is a month free that you can access. Anyone new can access that. And it does integrate automation such as priority screening, machine learning. Covidence is another tool. Again, Covidence is also really good and it's very popular, but it is also quite expensive. It's more expensive than EpiReviewer. I haven't used it in its complete form. I've only trialed it, and that was sort of, gosh, at least a year or two ago. I might need to look at it again. But yeah, I mean, lots of people find it really good. It has more of like a wizard approach to it. So Covidence will step you through the different stages of your review quite well in a really like, do this, now do that, now do this. Whereas EpiReviewer is, because it's been created for lots of different types of evidence synthesis, it is really flexible. And that flexibility means that you kind of need to know how to use it, and that it doesn't have just a simple wizard that's going to talk you through those steps. But once you know, it's really easy to use. And there are lots of webinars and videos on how to use it, which unfortunately feature my voice, so I apologize. But in terms of the structure, in terms of being able to thematically analyze your data, I find it really helpful. And it looks like this. And it is really important that you consider things like study design information, that you perhaps look at previous reviews that have been conducted and look at the types of data that they've also extracted, in how you can, and I've already mentioned that, in how you can construct your coding tool. It's just some more ideas of what different ways that I've extracted my data. Again, showing you that I use those codes to be able to then come up with my data extraction coding tool. And then what it looks like within EpiReviewer. So you're able to highlight, like NVivo, you're able to highlight within the PDF your example of a particular code in the text. Then you click on the code, click on the, an assign button, and all of that text is automatically assigned to that code. So it appears in any reports that you produce, like this. So you'd highlight that, click on the code and click the A button, and then it will appear just like this. And you can also use these blue info boxes to add any further information that you want to. You can also, with EpiReviewer, create these free interactive evidence and gap maps that you can then share alongside the products that you produce, which you can make freely available to people. And you can also create openly accessible web databases of all of your coding, which again, just along with, sort of open access, open science principles is really a wonderful way of being able to be transparent in your approaches and in your coding. This is a brilliant list of different kinds of tools that you can use, which is from CSO Jimenez and colleagues. Again, I'll provide all the references when I share my slides. But these are also some newer tools for use in evidence synthesis. Use with caution. So some helpful AI tools to help you find some literature, but also to help perhaps conduct some initial syntheses. But I will just say part of my work is also looking at evaluations of large language models to conduct this kind of work. And so far, the evidence is clear that it's not ready to be used solely to be used for this type of work. You need to use it as an aid rather than as a replacement. And they're just some funny examples of bias in the data that's been used to train ChatGPT, in terms of bias in terms of gender, bias in terms of representation, and yeah. It's important also to understand that ChatGPT itself is a language model. It's not a database. And these types of even Copilot, which has some really great potential to assist with some of the aspects of identifying and understanding studies, but they do have a real limitation in terms of being able to synthesize across and between. And there is obviously a place for them, but that I really want to implore you to consider them more as an aid, just to repeat myself. So some concluding thoughts for you are that evidence synthesis and qualitative evidence synthesis can be a really creative process, and it can involve quantitative data, even if you're coming from that qualitative mindset. And not to be afraid to use and combine different approaches. But it's really important that whenever you start any kind of evidence synthesis project, that you are able to answer that so what question. What is novel about the work that you're doing? Make sure that you differentiate between someone like other people's work, and that you're not just replicating work that's already been done. You need to choose your own path. You need to decide which type of evidence synthesis is right for your project. And that might be a scoping review or a mapping review or a rapid review, depending on your scope, depending on the time you've got for your project, depending upon what kind of insights you're wanting to gain from the data that you're synthesizing. And also in terms of technology, what can help you in terms of being able to conduct your evidence synthesis, and really ask yourself, is the technology reliable? Make sure that you are incredibly transparent, not just in terms of the search strategy you're using, but in terms of your reporting when it comes to your methods section. Make sure that you are explaining if you've used technology. How did you use that technology? What were the settings that you used? Did you use something like priority screening when you were using EpiReviewer? And if you did, how did you use it? Make sure your method section should be a recipe that other researchers are able to take and apply and replicate, so that it is updatable in the future as well. And finally, be brave. Reach out to people that, if you've got questions to find out more information, I'm one of those people that you can reach out to. Xin Wang is another one of those people, as head of evidence synthesis at NIOT. And just as a shameless plug, I am also involved in a scoping review, mapping review, and evidence gap map workshop coming up in July. And I'll send out some information about that and some additional resources as well. There you go. I'm sorry it was so long.
Thank you. Brilliant. Thanks, Mel. That's a very rich presentation, and as always, very charismatic and informative. Love that. Thanks. I'm just going to give you a break for your coffee. I'm just going to read aloud some of the questions in the chat for you. Ming Yu asked a question: when you report on a QES, would you acknowledge excluding quantitative evidence as a limitation, or is it not actually a limitation because the purpose is to synthesize qualitative evidence?
Oh, that's a good question. I would actually include it as an exclusion criteria, personally. And mixed methods as well, if you're going to exclude mixed methods, because when I approach my screening and my inclusion exclusion criteria, I'm really looking, when I'm screening these titles and abstracts, I'm looking for a reason to exclude them. And a reason to exclude it would be the fact that it uses quantitative methods or mixed methods. As soon as I saw that, it would be out. So personally, even though you're using that qualitative, like it's a QES, I would add it as an exclusion criteria. That's a really good question.
Thanks. And I think Timothy has another great question here.
Oh,
how do you approach different studies which take different paradigms? I found quite a diversity even with qualitative studies, when there is such a difference of opinion of what it means for qualitative research to be high quality. It seems like a tough choice between imposing your own views and being a bit soft on the studies under review.
That is such a good question. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so obviously it is really tricky. So one of the ways that you can get around that is when you're using the CASP tool, they ask specific questions. For example, oh, and I wish I had it in front of me. Something like, are the methods that are used appropriate for the research questions that are being asked? Is the analysis appropriate for what is there? So it's less about, I guess it's less about appraising their interpretation of what qualitative is, and it's more about, does the study design seem robust enough to answer the research question and to trust the evidence that's being presented, I think is the best answer that I could give. Yeah, but it is tricky, that's for sure. And there is that, researcher judgment as well. It does come in a little bit. And that's something you need to acknowledge in your limitations. Which is something I didn't mention. You should always include a section on limitations. And I prefer to put it in the method section, because you need to reflect on not only the limitations of the studies that you are synthesizing, but on your own way that you've conducted your evidence synthesis, as an aside.
Great answer. Quala has a question about inter-rater reliability, about how do we go about reporting on inter-rater reliability and validity in these kinds of papers?
Do you mean, how do you report inter-rater reliability for your evidence synthesis? I think, yeah, CASP. Yeah, okay. So I'm just, hang on, I'm just, for Timothy's benefit, it's called CASP. If you type in CASP critical appraisal tool or something like that, it should come up when you Google it. Yeah, so in terms of your inter-rater reliability, that comes down to when you are conducting the first stages of your review, you would need to do that at both screening on title and abstract stage and screening on full text stage. That's when I'd use that inter-rater, like the kappa values. You would need to screen, generally I'd screen about 10%, either 10%, or if your review is particularly large, I would screen at least 100 together in at least duplicate, if not more, because you might have more review team members. And then you would be looking purely at whether or not people have said include, exclude. If you have 2 team members screening, then you would calculate Cohen's kappa between those 2. But if you have 3 or more independent raters, then I would be using Fleiss kappa. Yeah, just because. And then personally, I set a high bar with my inter-rater values, a very high bar, sorry, Sinwang. And I try and get, honestly, a 0.8 above at least above 0.7, even with Fleiss kappa, to try and make sure that that level of agreement between the raters is high enough. There is that common understanding of what the inclusion exclusion criteria are. So I would do them in batches of 100 until I've reached, depending on the length of time I have for my project, I would do that in batches of 100 until we've reached the appropriate level. If I get to the point at which we've done at least 3 or 4 batches of 100, we're still not quite there, I will then choose to, first of all, set my set EpiReviewer into what's called priority screening mode, and that's using automation to sift the studies so that the ones that the system considers are going to be the most relevant come first, just to make life easier. And then I will make sure that we screen everything in duplicate for the rest of the portion of studies we have to screen on title and abstract. Then, luckily, I would repeat the process for screen on full text. And then for data extraction, I don't calculate inter-rater reliability. I would have everyone code in duplicate at least 5 studies, if there aren't many, using the coding tool we've devised. Then we will have a meeting and we'll talk through our approach to conducting that data extraction, discuss whether or not what we've done is appropriate. Obviously, in terms of the inductive coding, it can be quite difficult because one person's interpretation of something can be quite different to another person's interpretation. If there is that concern, you could separate it so that you have one person doing the inductive coding and then have another person check a portion of it and make sure there's that agreement. You could still, if you've got the money, you could have two people do it and then reconcile differences, or you could have you could simply have done enough together that you've got that common understanding and then trust that that you then do it separately. But that is a little bit optimistic with some studies. So sorry I talk so much. I love evidence synthesis and I could talk about it for days.
Right. Thanks, Mel. I think there are a few more questions, but I think in terms of the duration of the talk, I'm just going to cut it off here. I'm sure Mel will be able to answer some of those questions in the slides that she is going to share later on with additional links. And I think it's a very rich presentation with a lot of information, a lot of resources for us to consider. And I'm sure if you reach out to Mel, she'll be very happy to answer your questions at a later stage. But I just want to thank Mel very much for your presentation early in the morning, but it's very fruitful, very helpful. I also want to thank Mehdi, who helped organize the event so that everything goes smoothly. Thank you so much, our event organizer of the sake. Also want to thank everybody attending the event today. I'll be uploading a recording soon so that everyone can catch up on that together with the slides. Mel mentioned a number of times Epi Reviewer, and I'm sure you're kind of interested in that to know a little bit more about it. So stay tuned. We have another webinar, and it would be more like a hands-on workshop style event in December. This year, it's also online that Mel will be really going deep into Epi Reviewer about how to go about doing reviews on the software. So stay tuned if you're interested. So thank you so much again, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. It was very helpful.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much for coming.
See you again in December.